Hello, my name is Jake Mastro, and for the past, what I guess has been a pretty long time now, I've been working on a game for MS-DOS called Chuck Jones' Space Cop of the Future. Now, the game is a point-and-click adventure game about a 1970s detective that ends up in the far future and flies around in a rocket-powered El Camino. For this game, I had to write a lot of music, and I thought people might be interested in how I go about doing that and what makes composing music for MS-DOS particularly interesting. The idea of the game is to get a sort of a 1970s jazz funk type soundtrack and have it played on sort of 1990s era video game hardware and still sound authentically like a 1990s video game. So let's go over that. So if you're not really familiar with how video game music was done in the late 80s and early 90s, it's not like a normal piece of music that you would have on like a CD. It's not like pre-recorded with like actual instruments. It's synthesized in real time by sound chips. And that leads to a very interesting stylistic results. And a lot of people associate that with sort of chiptunes with this blanket term. But there's actually quite a bit of variation with how this was done. And particularly with MS-DOS, you start to get some interesting results. Now, what makes MS-DOS unique is that, let's say you have a video game system like, I don't know, the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis has a sound chip in it made by Yamaha, and every Sega Genesis has that sound chip or a version of it in there. And there are some Genesises, I'm not sure, that sound different, but they're not really like fundamentally different. They have maybe a different character, but they all fundamentally make sound in the same way, and any Genesis game is going to have the soundtrack play back on any Genesis in more or less the same way. Now, what makes MS-DOS unique is because MS-DOS essentially had no standard way of making sound. There were some very common options, but there was no actual standard. Like, you could have games that supported completely different sound hardware, and you could have different sound hardware in every PC, and most often games supported a variety of different sound devices. And not only are they different, they're for the most part completely incompatible and sound completely different. Like, you could play the same game on 3 different computers and have it sound as if it's being played by completely different instruments. So what I had to do was, first off, decide which of these devices am I going to support, and that really informed like how I'm going to make the music that I am going to make, because like, once again, it's not like any other type of music. The difference here is that what the user is listening to it on changes the kind of music. I hope that makes sense. So I decided to pick a variety of different devices, and I'll kind of go over them real quick. So like, I'm not going to get too much into all the history of these devices. Like, there's plenty of information you can find on YouTube or various other places sort of explaining the history of this, but I'm going to sort of talk about this, each device from like a composer's perspective. So the first device we're going to talk about is the PC speaker, because it was on every PC. But the biggest reason why a lot of games didn't use the PC speaker was just because it sucked. Like, it was you had one channel of square waves, so like bleep and bloops, that you could play, but like, you could only play one note at a time. Like, I'm going to use a fancy musical term, and I'm going to say that's one note polyphony, or monophony, if you will. But anyway, the PC speaker, it kind of sucked. Some people did some interesting things with it, and you can actually make it play multiple notes at a time, but that requires some very fancy programming, fancy and slow programming. A lot of games didn't use it, and if they did, they didn't have gameplay and music at the same time a lot of the time. Now, there are things you can do with this to make it sound better, and I sort of tried to do that in this game. So the next device we have is the Tandy sound chip. Now this is a Texas Instruments chip, I believe, that was in Tandy computers, which were sold by Radio Shack, and it was also in the IBM PC Junior. So this has the character that a lot of people commonly associate with chiptunes, where it's a square wave. It's kind of like what you're familiar with from NES music. Now, it's much more powerful than the PC speaker, because you could play 3 notes at a time, 3-note polyphony. So that's really useful. And also, you can not only can you control 3 notes at a time, but you can also vary their volumes, and you have 1 channel of noise. So you can have much more complex compositions, and it's a pretty interesting sounding sound chip. And the next sort of device we have is the Creative Music System. It's also called the CMS, or the Game Blaster. Now, I've never actually seen a Game Blaster or CMS in my entire life. They're very rare, but it was actually really easy to program for, and DOSBox emulates it. So I added that. Now, it's much like the Tandy, where it's just square waves and you can control the volume. It's got some noise, but what makes it really interesting is that it's 12 notes of polyphony. Now, this is like much more notes than anything that uses square waves that I can think of, unless you're talking about, like, you know, some kind of keyboard instrument. But it's a really interesting sound, and like it's like NES music if NES music had like an orchestra of Nintendos. You know what I mean? Let's talk about what is probably the closest thing to a standard that there was for MS-DOS games, and that is the Ad-Lib / Sound Blaster cards. I kind of lump them together because from a composer's perspective, they're basically the exact same thing. The Sound Blaster had some extra stuff for digital sampling, but that wasn't really practical for music until a bit later. Now, these cards have on them a chip, and this is the important part. It's called the Yamaha OPL chip. Now, that uses FM synthesis, which is sort of a fancy method of synthesis that creates sound using mathematics, essentially. And it's a bit more complex than that, but that's sort of beyond the scope. Explaining that is beyond the scope of this video. Now, but what's interesting is that it actually is quite similar to what you have in the Sega Genesis, which is, I believe it's a Yamaha OPN chip in the Genesis, but they have a very similar character because they're both FM synthesis chips, and they're both made by Yamaha, and a lot of people describe it as sort of like a twangy sound. It's kind of interesting. I really like it, and that's one of the reasons I really like MS-DOS games, is because of this sound. And it was used in so many games, like countless games, and it is sort of the sound of MS-DOS games. This is what I wanted to sort of target for Chuck Jones, but if it sounds good on the Ad-Lib Sound Blaster, I think that's how most people are going to hear it. It's quite a bit more advanced and sophisticated than some of the previous things I mentioned. It's got quite a bit more polyphony. You get anywhere between 6 and 18 notes of polyphony, depending on whether or not you're using drums and whether or not you're using the later OPL3 chip, which also added stereo sound. I want to move on a little bit and talk about what is probably the most expensive option at the time for MS-DOS game music, and that is the Roland MT-32. Now, this is a MIDI module. Now, what that is if you're not familiar with MIDI is just essentially a way of encoding sort of like the notes to music. It's sort of like digital sheet music that you can pump over a wire, and different devices will play back MIDI in different ways. Now, the Roland MT-32 became pretty common, or not common, but it became pretty relatively popular for video game music in the late 80s when it became used by Sierra Online for a lot of their graphic adventure games. And it still to this day has a stellar reputation. And ironically, given that it was so expensive in the day, I actually got my MT-32 like pretty cheap, and I still can't find a good price on like an original Ad-Lib card. So I don't know. Now I really want to support this because some of the sound for like the Sierra games in like the late 80s or even the LucasArts games like that used the MT-32 just sound amazing. But it's got a very like 80s vibe to it. It's pretty cool. Now it has 32 notes of polyphony, which is massive compared to everything else. So there's also a thing called General MIDI, which I also decided to support. And it's not really a sound device per se, it's just a class of sound devices. All it does is essentially just standardize what instruments are available over MIDI. When you ask for, let's say, a bass, you get a bass, and if you use this on a different module, you ask for a bass, you get some form of a bass, is the idea. Or like you ask for a saxophone, you get some interpretation of a saxophone. It was sort of became popular a little bit later in the 90s, but it's still pretty cool. And the most common device you'll see people talk about is also a Roland device. It's the Roland Sound Canvas. So now there are other devices, particularly later. There was some wavetable devices and things like that. But that's all that I decided to support, mainly because, you know, the era that I was kind of trying to capture the feel of and stuff like that, it didn't really jive with some of the later stuff. And also, there were some other things that were particularly more rare, like the SSI 2001, for example, that I decided not to support because I don't think anybody's going to use them. Or they were not worth the extra complexity of adding that code to the game. So now that I kind of had these devices planned, I knew what I wanted to support. I kind of had to come up with a way to do that, and that's really going to impact how I actually go ahead and make the music. Because it's like, if I wanted to like write for the MT-32, that's pretty easy because MT-32 is just MIDI, so you can go into any kind of MIDI edit, MIDI DAW. Like I use Reaper. Like normal music would be made today. It's the exact same process. But if I wanted to support like the PC speaker, that's another thing, because once again, like I have to be very creative with my musical choices because once again, only one note at a time. So I decided to kind of go in the middle. So because I really wanted to support both, absolutely my biggest two priorities were that I wanted to support the Ad-Lib, but I also wanted to support the MT-32. So what I decided to do was make my music using MIDI and then write a driver to play back that MIDI on the different devices. So if it were on something like the PC speaker, it would do its best to do fancy things and take all the notes and try to smush them all down onto one channel. Or if it were on the Tandy, it would do a little bit better with 3 channels. But basically, I would aim down the middle, aim for the Ad-Lib, and then it would be rendered differently on different cards. So that's what I did. So when I first started doing this, I had a bit of an issue, because, you know, writing music is most easily done when you can hear the music that you're writing. Seems pretty obvious, right? Now, my initial thought was that I would use some kind of software like a MIDI sequencer for MS-DOS. The first thing I tried was something called Voyetra Sequencer, or something like that. There was immediately some issues with that because, first of all, the game code, like, because the music is synthesized in real time, the code that plays back the music has a huge impact on what the music sounds like. Now, for the MT-32, it was actually fairly easy to do this because you just plug in MIDI to the MT-32. You could take the output of your DAW or whatever, plug it into the MT-32. You can play with it in real time and have it played back exactly by the MT-32, because the software in the game's perspective for MIDI is essentially just it's going to take a MIDI file and pump it out the other end. So there's not too much impact that it has there. So on something like the Ad-Lib, like if you're not using the same Ad-Lib driver to compose the music that is used in the game, it's gonna sound different. It's kind of hard to explain, but like the way that the notes interact, especially regarding polyphony and note priority, like you're gonna have some pretty strange results. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could take the Ad-Lib and use it like I do the MT-32, where I just plug it into my DAW and, you know, it sounds like it does. So, you know, wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of device like that? Now, it turns out that I had already created one. So the code that actually plays back the MIDI in the game on the Ad-Lib only needed to be tweaked slightly to just take MIDI over a wire and do the exact same thing with it. So I created a tool called Ad-Lib Host, which essentially you just use the computer as you would a MIDI module like the MT-32. So let's go over to the computer and, like, maybe if I give you a demo, this will be more clear. Let's try making a tune. So here we are over at the computer, or I guess multiple computers. Over here we have the old DOS PC we are going to use. This is a AST Premium 286. It is a Intel 286 class PC running MS-DOS, and it is approximately from the year 1988. Up top, you see we have our Roland MT-32, and over on here behind me, we have a Windows 10 PC, just your average Windows 10 PC. It doesn't really matter. Over here, just in the edge of the frame, you might see I also have a MIDI keyboard connected. So before I actually get into the process here, let me just get something a little bit controversial out of the way. Now, I do not actually use this PC over here to write the music. I in fact do it on a modern digital audio workstation on this Windows 10 PC right behind me. Now, I know that, like, it would probably be much more authentic to actually use a sequencer such as Voyetra on this PC. It's just the amount of time that I would have to put in versus the amount of output I get versus the amount of music I have to make. It just made sense for me to go with what I was familiar with, using a modern DAW like Reaper. But I do use this PC while I'm composing to actually hear the results of what I'm working on. Now, I'm about to show you how I hook this up so that I can hear real hardware Sound Blaster audio without any emulation while I am composing. And so that I hear, as I'm composing, exactly what it will sound like in the game. So we're going to need a couple things. And the first thing is some kind of Ad-Lib compatible sound card. In this computer here, I have a Sound Blaster 16. But literally any Ad-Lib compatible card will do. We're also going to need some kind of MIDI interface. Luckily, the Sound Blaster 16 actually has 2 MIDI interfaces built into it. And in order to access those, we're going to need a Sound Blaster MIDI cable. So this is just a cable that plugs into your game port and gives you a MIDI in and out on your Sound Blaster. I think some other sound cards used a similar cable, but this is just the one I'm using. I don't actually know where you can get these, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody on eBay is making these now and selling them. They're pretty simple cables. The other thing we're going to need is a MIDI interface. I'm going to be using a Focusrite that is off screen right now, but you can also use one of these like MIDI, like for example this Roland UM1 here. It's just a USB MIDI interface. Gives you MIDI in out on any kind of PC with USB. So the keyboard over here, this is a Roland EP7. There's nothing special about this. This is just a MIDI keyboard. It's got semi-weighted keys, but literally any MIDI keyboard will work. Even I've used MIDI keyboards that I've found, like those cheapy Yamahas. I found those even at garage sales for $5. Like literally anything will work. So the MIDI keyboard's not actually strictly necessary, but for the type of music that I'm doing, because I want to have that sort of jazzy, funky feel, I do like to have some form of input that I can play right into the computer. So all I do is in my DAW, I just make sure that it's going out of the MIDI interface. I plug my MIDI interface into this old PC here, and then I run a tool called Ad-Lib host, which I created, which basically just lets me listen back to what I'm working on as I'm doing it. And most often I will actually, in between that, I will run the MIDI cable into the MT-32's MIDI in, out of the MIDI through, and then into this computer. And that just lets me quickly listen to the MT-32 as well, so I can check back and forth so that it sounds good on both of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect our MIDI interface into our Windows 10 PC, or any PC really. We're going to take that interface, plug it into the MIDI in through this Sound Blaster cable, and then we are going to run the Ad-Lib host tool. So let's just quickly run Ad-Lib host here. And we can see that our computer is ready, and we're ready to just start pumping MIDI into it, and we'll be able to hear what it sounds like in just a minute. Okay, so we are here in Reaper now, which is my DAW of choice. We are going to create a little tune for all of you. So the first thing we're gonna want to do is just create a new track. We're gonna start with drums here, and we absolutely need to make sure that we are setting the output of this to our MIDI interface. Just to remind you, this computer is going out through the MIDI interface into the MT-32, out the MIDI through of the MT-32, and into the back of my Sound Blaster on my DOS PC. Now you can probably hear it right now. The fan is spinning. And I apologize for that, but there's not really anything I can do about that because we need it to be on so that we can use the Sound Blaster inside of it. I have turned off the CRT though, so you will not hear the annoying CRT whine. So I guess without further ado, let's add some drums. Just gonna go ahead and insert a new MIDI item. Our BPM we're gonna start with 120 because that's pretty normal, I guess. And then we're going to make sure that we set our output to channel 10 because that is where our drums live. Because that's how General MIDI has its drums, and I've set up both the FM playback routines and the MT-32 to correspond more or less to General MIDI by having some custom patches that more or less match General MIDI so that when we play this back on General MIDI, it sounds kind of okay as well. So we're going to start by just, Yeah, let's just loop this and add some beats on 2 and 4 to sorry, add some kick drums and then add some snares on 2 and 4, because that is that's how you do a little bit of funk here. I'm just gonna add some a little bit of cool. And let's add some hi-hats. So yeah, this is the FM drums on the Yamaha OPL. That's a bit fast, actually. Yeah, let's slow that down a bit. Cool. Yeah, that's a bit of funk. So yeah, let's add a little bit of expression on that. So yeah, we have the hi-hats open up. They change the parameters on the FM thing. Sorry, the FM playback code is going to change the parameters of the hi-hats so that they can be open and closed, which is pretty cool. And there is also some velocity, so let's add some expression. Just so it sounds a little bit like it's a robot, even though it is. So that's our that's a really basic drum loop we have here. Now I'm gonna go ahead and insert a bass. Let's try, just to get a little bit of funky bass here. And then I also need to make sure that that is set to go out to our MIDI output. And let's insert another MIDI item. Let's loop that. Let's just okay, yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and set the patch here, general MIDI, and we're going to go with slap bass number 1, because I believe that is a very FM sounding patch that I have in my patch bank, and I will create that. So yeah, it just needs to actually play the thing so that it can send the MIDI message to the playback routines. So let's add a little bit of bass. Let's make that a little octave, you know, some funky stuff. All right, we got our funky FM bass here sounding. Let's just cool. So yeah, that's a basic thing. Let's just add another bar of that. Yeah, let's. I'm gonna go ahead and just glue this. So yeah, so I'm just gonna go ahead and glue that so I can mess around with the second bit here. I'm just gonna go ahead and delete that because we don't need to change again. And yeah, so every note actually, this is gonna make your playback routine run a little bit slower if it's got more notes and more MIDI messages. So it's good to sort of minimize the number of message changes and things that you're adding. But yeah, let's delete that. Let's just... All right, pretty janky, but you know, it's kind of cool. Let's just extend this a little bit longer, and then let's add some keyboards. I mean, I guess it's all yeah. So we're gonna go ahead once again, focus right here, and let's insert new MIDI item. Let's make it start A little bit later though. Let's do a little bit of just drum and bass in the intro. All right. So yeah, let's just make sure that we set this to be a. I'm gonna go ahead with a electric piano number 1 because that also is a cool sound. So now let's go with the electric piano number 2. Actually, I think I might like that better. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we need to make sure that we're on channel 2. Yeah, there we go. There's our FM electric piano sound. Channel 2. Yeah, so we just need to make sure that we're on a different channel than our first track because otherwise it's gonna all the message changes are gonna mess up the patches for the other track, and we don't want that. So, all right, what was it? This is in, what key is this in? Okay, let's cool, let's just loop this here. Ooh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's funky. Okay, so here's what we'll do. Let's add a little bit of. Yeah, here we go. Let's make that a bit. Oh yeah. Cool. All right, let's bring another one in here. Yeah, baby. All right. Oh yeah. So I just want to point out, so once again, we're keeping the polyphony low. I think right now we have like 4 melodic instruments going at a time, and I don't think we really want to go above 6. But that is just to remind you guys, there's not a lot of tracks available on most of these instruments, so we should keep the number of notes that we want at a time to be pretty low. But you know, you can still get some triads and things. You can get your funky sounds going on. So let's add some more of that. All right, yeah, that's pretty funky, but I think I actually want to slow that down a little bit. Let's go to 110, and let's hear that. It's all right. That's the loop is in reposition here. All right. Okay, I do like that better at 110. All right, let's but I do need to rework this bass line, I think, a little bit. All right, let's and then let's just tweak that so it's still. Let's delete that. Yeah, once again, just getting rid of that. Let's add a little bit of a Okay, well, once again, this needs to be on channel 2. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's, I think that's about as much as I'm gonna do here. But, not my best work, but, it'll serve the purposes of demonstration. Let's just quickly listen to it back. Pretty cool. So yeah, there's a little bit of snippet, and let's also hear that on the MT-32. So let's play that one more time. I will switch the audio for you. Cool. So yeah, there we go. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you want more information, or you want me to go over more of the patch bank stuff, because that's a bit more complicated, I can do that. But I think this will serve as a purpose of demonstration for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think.